Benghazi in Libya, with the murder of our ambassador Chris Stevens and several other embassy personnel, and the subsequent cover-up and lying coming out of the Obama administration, is kind of in microcosm what we have been dealing with for years now in a massive misapprehension of the threat of jihad and Islamic supremacy. This is the fruit, the bitter fruit of what I call fantasy-based policymaking. That we have pretended that various things are so, and acted upon them, and now we are seeing that that kind of fantasy kills. It is absolutely lethal, and we have to stop it and fire those who are responsible for it. What I mean is this. Up until 2009, I rather regularly gave addresses to FBI groups, to CIA, I'm not supposed to say that, well, too late, to Joint Terrorism Task Force, to various military organizations, and so on. I was not alone. There were many others among my colleagues and co-workers who also gave this kind of address to FBI and to various other relevant agencies. The Obama administration ended all that. And they ended it because, as you all have no doubt heard, Islam is a religion of peace that's been hijacked by a tiny minority of extremists. And those people you see beheading people and shouting Allahu Akbar and quoting the Quran to justify what they're doing, they actually misunderstand the true peaceful teachings of Islam. And when the Quran says, slay the unbelievers wherever you find them, if this is properly understood, you would see that it means give the unbelievers a big hug. And everything is okay. Now, what this has led to was a systematic cleansing of all the training materials for FBI and Homeland Security and all other relevant agencies, such that they never mention Islam in connection with terrorism. Now, what that means essentially is this. It means that the people who are supposed to be guarding us against Islamic jihadis are not allowed to examine their own motives and goals. They are not allowed, in other words, to know your enemy, which is the first tenet of waging a successful war. They are not allowed to understand what their enemy is trying to do and how he is trying to do it. It is forbidden. Now, what does that have to do with Benghazi? Very briefly, Stevens, the ambassador, knew that there were Islamic supremacists and jihadists who were planning something. And he asked for additional personnel to foot around the consulate in Benghazi. This request was ignored. Why was it ignored? Because we all know that the new regime in Libya is a glorious pro-Western, pluralist, democratic regime that loves America and espouses Western values, and was actually put there courtesy American military might. The reality is, however, is that Benghazi was the center of the resistance to Gaddafi, who was undeniably odious. There are no good guys in this fight. Benghazi was the center of resistance to Gaddafi, but you know what else Benghazi was? Benghazi was the place in the world that gave the most Al-Qaeda fighters to Iraq to fight against American troops. It is the center of Al-Qaeda and Islamist activity. And it was also the center of the rebellion against Gaddafi, which Ambassador Stevens was so excited about. He actually snuck into the country at a time when things were very hot there so that he could aid the rebels. And the United States government went on record aiding the rebels. They were wonderful democratic pluralists. They were really Al-Qaeda. But we ignored all that and pretended it wasn't so. Fantasy-based policymaking. Consequently, when it became clear that the embassy was under threat, the Obama administration could not acknowledge that this threat was real, because it would have shown them up for having supported this uprising in the first place. It would have shown that they were actually aiding people who have sworn to destroy the United States and kill as many Americans as possible. And so they could not possibly have aided the embassy or have given it additional security because it would have shown their whole series of actions in Libya to be wrong. And so what we have to show for it is Ambassador Stephens is dead, several other embassy personnel are dead, and the administration is lying and piling lie upon lie to try to keep it all from, thank you so much, keep it all from getting out. But look, the reality is that the uprising was not spontaneous, as we all know. It was not about a video of Muhammad. We all know this now. But what was it really about? What was it really for? Why did they do it? Well, in the first place, it was no coincidence that it happened on September 11th. Obviously, this was intended to be a special commemoration of the 9/11 attacks. But what else it was all about became clear at the UN General Assembly meeting in New York just a couple weeks ago, where Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the president of Iran, spoke, and many other Muslim leaders from around the world spoke, and they all said the same thing. Now, this was not reported in the Western press, and so probably you didn't hear about this remarkable unanimity in everything that they said, but you had a representative of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is 57 Muslim governments, 56 nations, and the Palestinian Authority around the world, the largest voting bloc at the UN. You had the president of Pakistan, you had the Iranian president, you had the prime minister of Turkey and others, and they all said the same thing. They said free speech has its limits, and the West has to criminalize criticism of Islam so that this kind of video cannot be made. And they were maintaining that the video was the cause. The video was not the cause of the riots. It was the pretext that was fastened upon for the riots and chosen by the people who planned the riots so that they could compel the West to criminalize the freedom of speech. And that's what this is all about. My friends, this is the fundamental battle of the 2012 election that nobody knows about. That the First Amendment to the Constitution is under grave threat. Now wait, you will say to me, but wait a minute, it's the First Amendment to the Constitution. You can't get around that. Well, have you ever tried to carry a handgun in New York City? In other words, we have the right to bear arms guaranteed by the Second Amendment, but it's been legislated away and given so many exceptions and restrictions and hedges around that it's effectively null and void in many important areas of the United States. The same thing not only can happen to the First Amendment, but it is in the process of happening to the First Amendment even now, and Barack Obama is aiding and abetting it. And one of the main reasons why we have to kick him out is because freedom of speech is our fundamental bulwark against tyranny. The freedom of speech was put into the Bill of Rights in the first place because the founding fathers recognized that if we did not have a right to dissent, then a tyrannical government could do whatever it wished and have no one contradicting it. And so freedom of speech is our safeguard against an authoritarian regime that can work its will on people without being questioned. It is absolutely, in other words, the foundation of any free society. And it is under grave threat. The Islamic governments are trying to compel the West to criminalize freedom of speech, and they have introduced, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation has introduced resolutions into the UN every year for the last 7 years, calling upon member states to criminalize defamation of religions or incitement to religious hatred. Now you have to understand between the lines here that Christianity is insulted all the time. You know, you put a crucifix in a jar of urine, you get money from the National Endowment for the Arts. But you insult Islam, then there are calls for then there are riots and killings and calls for the restriction of defamation of religions. The whole purpose of those laws is to impose upon the West an aspect of Sharia, Islamic law, which makes it forbidden for non-Muslims to speak anything critical about Islam or Muhammad or the Quran. Now you might think, well, I don't care. Islamic terrorists who are beheading and killing people and shouting death to America and quoting chapter and verse of Islam's holy texts to justify what they're doing and recruit new people to do it with them, then we have to talk about Islam, Muhammad, and the Quran to understand the enemy, which is what the State Department has forbidden itself to do. And so, if it becomes illegal to defame or speak critically or even commit what is called hate speech, although it isn't in any objective sense, about religion, then what will be outlawed is any effective anti-terror effort that understands what our enemy is all about. And then they can just advance unhindered, because we will be mute and defenseless in the face of that advance. Now anyway, there are many aspects to this, and I'm trying to be as brief as possible and get it all in. But this is what is happening. The resolutions that have been introduced into the UN every year by the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, call upon member states to criminalize this defamation of religions, by which they mean criticism of Islam, by which they mean counter-terror investigations. Every year the United States opposed them until last year, when the United States supported it. And Resolution 16/18 of the United Nations calls upon member states to introduce legislation into their own countries that will criminalize religious defamation. And the Obama administration signed on to it. And of course there was a codicil saying, well, we have this First Amendment thing, and so we can't do anything about it yet. But we will work toward this in any way that we can. Now, how are they working toward it? There are many ways in which it is already happening. Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, had a 3-day closed door, not open to the press or the public, meeting with the head of the OIC precisely to discuss methods of implementation of Resolution 1618 last November in Washington. Nobody knows what they discussed. Nobody knows what was said there. But Hillary Clinton came out of that meeting and she said, well, we do have this First Amendment, but we have to do something about all this hate speech. So I'm going to tell you a story about hate speech. I am the co-founder of a group called the American Freedom Defense Initiative with an activist in New York named Pamela Geller, who I admire a great deal because she is the one person in the whole country, maybe the whole world, who is putting the jihadis on the defensive, and instead of bending over backwards and apologizing to them and giving them what they want and accommodating them, which the Obama administration is doing in many ways, she's taking the battle to them and breaking through, piercing through the fog of disinformation that covers us in the United States about these issues and the lies that the mainstream media tells us about these issues, and makes it so that they have to explain unpleasant elements of their program and their agenda. So, she conceived of an advertising campaign that said this. It's a very simple ad, and it says, in any war between the civilized man and the savage, support the civilized man, support Israel, defeat jihad. What she had in mind was the murders of the Fogel family you may have heard of, who were a family in Israel who were savagely murdered in their sleep by a Palestinian jihadis who I won't get into it, I know you're reading, but they murdered even the smallest children. This is something that not only does not get you prosecuted in Gaza or in the Palestinian Authority West Bank, but it will get you celebrated as a hero. And so she quite rightly considered that to be savagery that ought to be opposed, and put out this ad. The ad was rejected. In New York, they had this standard, the New York City Metropolitan Transit Authority had a standard that said if an ad is demeaning to a group, it cannot be put up. Now, I don't know if you've been to New York City and you've looked at the advertisements, it's kind of astonishing to think, but this was the first time that demeaning standard had ever been applied to anyone. This one ad. Now, the thing about demeaning is, it's in the eye of the beholder. Everyone insisted that the ad referred to all Muslims as savages, when actually it's quite clear about defeating the jihad against Israel, which is undeniably savage. And that's what it was about. But because they decided that all Muslims were referred to, it was demeaning, it was hate speech, and it was not allowed. We sued on First Amendment grounds, and we won. That's all. That's good news so far. But don't worry, I'll get you more depressed in a minute. In Washington, we put in the same ad, and the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority also refused the ad, saying people are rioting. This was just a few weeks ago. People are rioting in the Middle East. So if we put that in there, it might upset them some more. And innocent people will get killed. That's known as the heckler's veto. You don't like somebody saying something, then you beat him up, and then he shuts up. We in the United States have never honored that. We have always said, I don't agree with what you have to say, but I will defend you to the death your right to say it. We have never bowed to violent intimidation and said, I will shut up because you might hit me. But I'll tell you something. We sued on that, in that case, and won as well. But I was at the hearing. Geller and I were both at the hearing in Washington a couple weeks ago. And the judge was saying to the lawyer, she was practically pleading with the lawyer for the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, saying, I think this ad is hate speech, but I can't square that with the First Amendment. And there has to be some provision for disallowing this kind of hate speech. And our lawyer had to gently remind her that hate speech is not actually, hate speech is not a category in American law. It's not illegal, even if we accept that it is hate speech, which we do not. The problem with a designation of hate speech is that it is entirely up to the person who has the power to decide what hate speech is. I think much of what Barack Obama says is hateful. I think the way Joe Biden behaved in the vice presidential debate is hateful. But I don't get to decide that because the people who are in the media think that Barack Obama and Joe Biden are great and that Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan are not. And so it's all a matter of whose perspective gets to be the one that is decisive. And this is the problem. This has never been an element in American public life before. But even though we won both of those cases, there was, at the time, and I'm talking about like last week and 2 weeks ago, an avalanche of attacks in the mainstream media calling for the criminalization of what they call power hate speech and excoriating the judge in New York and the judge in Washington for ruling in our favor. The Los Angeles Times came out for hate speech restrictions, the New York Daily News, the Washington Post, and others. Now, little do they realize, apparently, that they're cutting their own throat. That if I get in power and I think that the Los Angeles Times and Washington Post are hateful and hate speech laws are legal, then I'll use them on them. I wouldn't, actually, because I don't believe in hate speech laws. But the point is that whoever is in power has an unbridled ticket to tyranny if hate speech laws are implemented. And this brings us back around to Hillary Clinton and her closed-door meeting. She came out of it and she said, we have this First Amendment, but we need to practice good old-fashioned public shaming on those bigots and racists who are in American public life today. And I don't know what good old-fashioned public shaming is. Put me in the stocks or something, but actually I do know what it is, and it's exactly what's happening. It's precisely what she's doing, and the Los Angeles Times, and the New York Daily News, and the Washington Post, and the New York Times, and all the rest of them, when they call us bigots and racists and Islamophobes and hate mongers for telling truth that they do not want known, and for speaking up for positions that are unpopular to the elites. This is why this election is so important. This is why the freedom of speech is hanging in the balance. We do have the First Amendment, but what I am trying to tell you is there are active efforts afoot to restrict it. And they could happen. Sotomayor and Kagan, Obama's Supreme Court appointees, are both on record calling for various restrictions on the freedom of speech. So is Julius Genachowski, his FCC chief, and many, many others in his administration. if he is in an unaccountable position, not having to seek re-election again, it is, I think, not just likely, but certain that very severe restrictions I hope that you will not think that this is just hysterical and fear-mongering. I've been accused of fear-mongering before. In January 2011, I said that the uprisings in Egypt and Libya and Tunisia were not flowerings of democracy and pluralism, but were Islamic supremacist pro-Sharia takeovers that would install regimes dedicated to Islamic law and more hostile to America than anything that had been there previously, even Gaddafi. And I was on Fox, and Juan Williams said, "Oh, Spencer, it's just fear-mongering." Well, here we are, a year and a half later, and it turns out that I was right all along. Now, I am not telling you that to tell you that I'm so smart. I'm not so smart. I just had my eyes open. And anybody who had his or her eyes open at the time would have seen the same things. But fantasy-based policymaking rules the day in Washington. They do not have their eyes open. People are getting killed because they do not have their eyes open. And worst of all, there are these movements afoot to forcibly close our eyes as well. So we must stand up to it, and if, God forbid, Romney does lose in November 2012, remember, this ain't over. But we have to fight for our very basic freedoms in that case. And there will be a long road ahead to fight for them, but as our founding fathers said in the Declaration of Independence, we pledge our lives and our fortunes and our sacred honor, so we should not be unwilling to make the same sacrifice, or be willing to defend our freedoms, because I can tell you that if we are not willing, then we will surely lose them. Thank you. Questions, comments, agreements, disagreements?
Robin, sure, we've got questions.
Yes, ma'am.
I and my husband both watched that video on the innocence of Muslims.
Yeah.
And I can honestly tell you that there's nothing innocent about them whatsoever, or their Muhammad, the way he would kill in front of a woman's, kill the husband of the woman standing right there and then take her in and rape her. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, that's a
Nothing
true story.
innocent whatsoever.
Yeah, Muhammad, actually, I wrote a biography of Muhammad according to the earliest Islamic texts available about him in 2006 called The Truth About Muhammad, available now in any self-respecting bookstore. And anyway, the story that you were recounting is absolutely in Islamic tradition. And it is an element of Islamic law to this day. Because Muhammad is considered normative for all Muslim behavior. If Muhammad did something, it's good and right. And so in Islamic law, you have a manual of Islamic law in office, and it says that if a woman is captured in battle, her marriage is immediately annulled. And the Quran says that you can have up to 4 wives, as well as the captives whom your right hands possess. That means slave girls. And the slave girls are often the wives of warriors who were fighting against the Muslims and captured in battle. Now, this all sounds fantastic. I mean, not fantastic like if you're a 12-year-old boy fantastic, but unbelievable that this could be talked about in 2012. But I want to give you an example. Not 1, but 2, actually 3 Islamic leaders in the last year have openly called, one in Kuwait, one in Egypt, and one in Saudi Arabia. And you can find all 3, the transcripts of everything, on my website, jihadwatch.org. If you search for sex slavery, I know it's kind of a dodgy thing to go on the internet and search for sex slavery, but just at Jihad Watch. And you will find Islamic scholars in these 3 nations saying that Islam calls for this, for the enslaving of captured infidel women. And our Muslim men need this, and we ought to be doing this and capturing infidel women in Chechnya, where there's a jihad going on against the Russians and the Caucasus, and so on. This is a real live thing. And see, if Barack Obama heard me right now, or Hillary, she would say, well, you are in for public shaming now because you're committing hate speech. But I'm just, it's a funny thing. I can quote Quran and it's hate speech, but the Quran itself is not hate speech. If an imam quotes Quran and says, slay the unbelievers wherever you find them, or fight against the Jews and the Christians until they pay the jizya tax and submit to your rule, then that's multiculturalism. But if I quote it, then it's hate speech. And this is the insidious nature of what we're dealing with. Yes, ma'am?
Why do we not hear the leaders of
The leaders of the Muslim religion speak out against these terrorists because the Muslim religion is not actually peaceful. It does teach warfare against unbelievers. It does teach that Muslims have the responsibility to fight against primarily Jews and Christians, but not solely Jews and Christians, until they submit to Islamic rule and are deprived of basic rights and considered inferiors before the law. This is basic Islam. And hot war or cold war, any kind of war will do, but it is a responsibility to wage this war. And so, does this mean that every Muslim is a terrorist? Absolutely not. But it's just like in Christianity. In Christianity, there's some people who are very fervent and devout, and some people who are not. But the ones who are not likely to stand up and denounce the ones who are. They probably think, well, if I were real religious, I would be like that. And so they respect them. It's the same thing in Islam. There are many Muslims who just want to live their lives and have a family and have a job. And, they're not bothered about any of this. They're not particularly religious. But the ones who are religious, they know what is being taught. They know what's taught in these texts. And they live by it. The ones who are not, they see that and they respect it. So they're not going to denounce them.
Then why do they choose to live in a Christian-based country?
This goes back to the beginning of Islam. According to Islamic tradition, none of this really happened. That's my other book, Did Muhammad Exist? But according to Islamic tradition, 12 years into Muhammad's career, he moved from Mecca to Medina, 2 cities in Arabia. And when he moved to Medina, he had been invited by the Medinans to rule over them. And he eventually brought the whole of the city and the whole of Arabia under his rule. And so it became a part of Islamic doctrine. Remember I said everything Muhammad did, it's normative, to emigrate from one area to another in order to bring Islam to the new area. And that's what we're dealing with. The word for immigrants in Arabic is al-muhajirun. And al-muhajirun is the name of, or was the name of, a pro-Sharia, pro-Islamic law, pro-terror group in England, which gives you, in microcosm, an example of what they're about. That they're immigrating to England in order to conquer and Islamize England. It's happening here in the United States. There was a celebrated case a few years back of a charter school, a public school in Minnesota that was teaching Islam. It was all Muslim students, and turned out it was giving Quran classes and teaching Islam on school grounds. And so there was a case about it where they were found in violation of the rules about not teaching religion on public school grounds and so on. But what went unremarked in all of the coverage of the school was the name of it, the Tariq ibn Zayed Academy. And this is because Tariq ibn Zayed is probably not somebody you would be able to pick out of a lineup, but he was a great Muslim warrior in the Middle Ages who emigrated to, or actually invaded, Spain, I believe it was, and fought, established a beachhead and said, we're going to stand on this ground and fight to the death and conquer from here. And he established his base, or Al-Qaeda, the base. And from there, they conquered the rest of the country. So the Tariq ibn Zayed Academy, even by naming itself after a man like that, is saying, we're going to come to America and stand here and conquer and Islamize it. Yes, sir.
So they say of appeasement that they're feeding the crocodile so as they'll be eaten last. And Obama clearly is in that mold. But why would our media also fall into that mold?
Well, it does puzzle me as to why the media would be on the side of these people. it's kind of interesting to note that all around the world, there is this huge alliance between leftists and Islamic supremacists. And yet, it would seem like they're completely at odds. Because if you look at leftists, and you know, with the moral libertinism and the general atheism and secularism, it wouldn't seem to go with these fanatical Sharia supremacists who want to subjugate women and put them in burqas or hijabs at least, and all the rest of it. So there are a couple things about it though. One is that I think that there's a great insight that was discovered by my friend and colleague Jamie Glazow, who's the author of a book called United in Hate, which I highly recommend. And in it he says this, that every time the hard left, the far left, gets into power, there's a reign of terror. You know, the Soviet Union, China, Vietnam, Pol Pot in Cambodia, always a reign of terror. And why do they have the reign of terror? To establish the just communist society where everybody is equal. And so it's sort of a Procrustean bed, and everybody is fit onto it, and what doesn't fit gets cut off. Islam is also like that. Islam also wants to establish a perfect society on earth. And a perfectly just society in the Islam view would be a society ruled by Islamic law, which, if you get out of line, has a slow motion reign of terror. Stonings, amputations, beheadings. Everybody who gets out of line is cut off. And so he suggests from that there's a very deep ideological kinship there, that they're both totalitarian systems that institute a reign of terror to establish what they see as a just society. And I think that there's a lot to that. Also, I think it's a marriage of convenience, much more simply, that they both hate America. They're both dedicated to the destruction of Judeo-Christian civilization. And so they're using each other. Yes, sir.
Are you also fighting against so-called hate crimes? You know, where you get double the penalty or because somebody says you hated the person that you subject to the crime?
We are not fighting directly against the hate crimes laws, which are on the books already. It's something that needs to be done. But generally with the American Freedom Defense Initiative, with Pamela Geller, and with my work with Jihad Watch, I am dealing primarily and solely with matters regarding Islamic terrorism, jihad, attempts to bring Islamic law here, and so on. The hate crimes laws, however, are very insidious. There was a specific exception made saying we're not talking about hate speech when they were passed. But the problem with that is that that's completely incoherent, because you don't really have a hate crime without speech that makes it a hate crime. Otherwise, you don't really know that the person is being beat up because he's black or whatever. And so it really is a criminalization of hate speech, and that is very insidious. Part of the recovery and the protection of the First Amendment that we have to do is repeal all kinds of hate crimes laws. A crime is a crime. There's really not a category of love crime anyway. If I love you, I'm probably not going to kill you. Eric?
Robert, I mean, that's the way you lay out the problem brilliantly and succinctly, but what do we do?
What do we do?
Yeah.
Everybody always asks me that, and I can't, that's the one question I can't answer. And I'll tell you why I can't answer it. Because I don't know what you can do. But I can tell you what has to be done. Obviously, we have to defeat Barack Obama. Obviously, we have to defeat everybody Barack Obama has ever associated with in a favorable manner. Obviously, that's one thing. But also, in your situation in life, and in all of your situations in life, you have various access to various people. You have, maybe in the New Hampshire Assembly, the ability to pass certain laws. You may be a private citizen who can write, or who can motivate people to act, or who can raise awareness of these issues. You may be, in other words, able to give your time and your talent and your resources to this fight. But that's the one thing I can't tell you how to do. I can tell you that we need to act on the very local level. that you need to tell all your friends. You need to convince people of the magnitude of this threat, because this is one thing that we are being lied to about. Part of fantasy-based policymaking and fantasy-based media reporting is that it lulls us all into complacency about what's really going on. So we have to be the media. And you know, Eric has a blog, and I have a site, Pamela Geller has a site. We have to withdraw our approval of things like the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on, and unmask them for what they are. Every time I put up a story about although it does come in handy if you want to write a book, that you have all the sources there easily notable. But the thing is that we have to start holding these people accountable. I try to avoid, whenever possible, telephone interviews where the reporter says, "Can I call you up and we'll talk over this?" No, send me your questions in email, and then I have them dead to rights. Because I get the answers, I put the answers that I want to put exactly as I want to put them, and I have the record. And then compare that to what they reported, and often there's no resemblance, but then I can publish myself what I really said and show them to be what they really are. Now this is what I can do, because I work in this field of writing and communicating and trying to raise awareness. But there are any number of ways that you can raise awareness, and that's the fundamental thing that we have to do, to try to break through the fog of disinformation and misinformation that envelops everyone we know and is all around us, and to bring awareness of the truth to people as much as possible.
Janine.
You had mentioned where I could get model legislation to stop
American Law for American Courts.
American Law for American.
Yeah, the American Freedom Law Center is an organization founded by our lawyers, our AFDI lawyers, who ably defended us, ably pressed our case as plaintiffs in these freedom of speech cases I told you about in New York and in Washington, also in Detroit and elsewhere. David Yerushalmi and Robert Muse are the two lawyers who founded it. And David Yerushalmi is the leading anti-Sharia legal theorist in the country. And he's formulated a template for legislation to outlaw Sharia. You know, there are many, many states that have tried to outlaw Islamic law. And Oklahoma voted in November 2010. 70% of Oklahomans voted to outlaw Sharia. And the left's response was twofold, and the Islamic response was twofold. One was derision and scorn, saying, "What, there's going to be a Sharia takeover of Oklahoma? And that's ridiculous, you don't need a law like that." And second, to say, "Well, we have to strike down this law." Well, wait a minute. If it's a completely superfluous and ridiculous law, why did they spend millions to strike it down? Obviously, they know what it's all about. They know that there are efforts to bring Islamic law to the West. They know there have already been cases in American courts where Islamic law has been used as a consideration. And so they had to try to stop this law, because it is their program to bring Islamic law to the West. So they did. They got a leftist judge, a Clinton appointee, who they convinced her that it was just a matter of personal religious observance, and that if they outlawed Sharia in Oklahoma, then Muslims couldn't get married in mosques and couldn't do various basic ordinary things. Well, yeah, it was all silly, because we don't care, I don't anyway, and I doubt you do, about Islamic law, meaning that if a Muslim wants to read the Quran, or wants to get married in a mosque, or divide up his inheritance in various ways, I couldn't care less. Have at it. I only care about Islamic law in the way that Thomas Jefferson said, "My neighbor believes in one God or 17 and neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg." But Islamic law does pick my pocket and break my leg. And so, that is the elements of Islamic law that are political, authoritarian, supremacist, and oppressive, I oppose. And all Americans should oppose, because they're absolutely inimical to the freedoms guaranteed us by the Constitution. But most people don't know that. And they think, well, it's just like Jewish law or Catholic canon law, because we keep getting lied to. And so here again, I have to raise awareness of these issues. Yes, sir.
I got a question about the ads that appeared in New York and Washington, Detroit, and elsewhere. Aside from what the press said, or from what lawyers said, do you have a sense of the public response to these ads, the average person?
Oh, yeah, sure. I have gotten, and I know Pamela Geller has got quite a few more, very appreciative emails and letters of support saying that they are very happy that somebody is finally telling the truth about these things and getting the word out about them. But at the same time, there's a fear in regard to this whole thing, and this is part of the whole process. I can tell you that we were in Stockholm, in Sweden, she and I and a group of other people who were speaking at an outdoor rally there in August. And the left was surrounding us on all sides, but the Stockholm police were very good. The Swedish police, they had ringed us all around with police vans and horses and all kinds of things. And so these furious and angry, quite lethal leftists couldn't get at us. But what we heard after that was that there were quite a few people who had wanted to attend the rally, but they didn't dare, not because solely because they would have been physically threatened by the leftists, which they would have, but also because they were taking pictures of them, and they were going to send them to their employers and so on, find out who they were, try to get them fired and so on, for attending our rally. Well, this kind of thing is not happening in the United States to that degree yet. But it is happening, that there is, here again, Hillary's good old-fashioned public shaming going on. And so I know that, for example, the Ground Zero Mosque and the attempt to build this 16-story mosque right at Ground Zero in a clear gesture of celebration of the attacks. There are triumphal mosques on the sites of jihad victories all over the world. And anyway, 70% of Americans were polled saying they were in favor of stopping that mosque. They were against the mosque. But the media hammering at it all the time and saying it was racist and bigoted to oppose this mosque, and only hateful people oppose the mosque, and so on. And they whittled that down. And it's the same thing with the ads, that there's a constant stream of stories. It's really dizzying. In all these, the highest profile media outlets saying these ads are hateful. It intimidates people and it confuses them. But yeah, we do have a lot of support nevertheless. Yes, ma'am.
How would Sharia law affect us?
Sharia law would affect us in so many ways. One is that we would not be able to have this conversation because you would not be here, because you would not have been allowed out of the house without permission from a male guardian, either your brother or your father or your husband. And he would probably not let you come, almost certainly not let you come, to see somebody who was committing blasphemy, according to Sharia, which is speaking slander against Muhammad and the Quran and Islam. Now, slander, you might say, slander is lying. If I slander you, I've told a lie. But in Islamic law, get a manual of Islamic law and read the definition of slander. It doesn't say lying about somebody. It says saying something about someone they don't want known. It could be true, you see. And so I'm speaking these things. This is blasphemy according to Islam. So I would be dead. You'd be at home. And what else? What do we have to eat? Did we have any pork?
Yeah,
Bacon on the salad? No way. Anybody have any wine with dinner? Anything like that? Obviously that would be out.
How about clothes?
Clothes, you would have to, Muhammad said that a woman has to cover everything except her face and hands. Now, the burqa, of course, covers the whole face, because the idea of that is that if a man is tempted by the sight of a woman, it is the woman's fault, and responsibility to make sure he ain't tempted. So in other words, men have no responsibility to learn any kind of self-control. Women have the responsibility to remove the temptation. And so if your face is a source of temptation, you've got to cover that as well. That's why in Afghanistan and in Yemen and other countries where it's very strict, they cover the whole face. But Muhammad actually says the face can be uncovered. In any case, there are many, many other ways as well. If you have a job in which you hold any authority and you had a Muslim employee, then you would have to lose your job because Islamic law does not allow a non-Muslim to hold authority over Muslims. The colloquial, the term, the slang phrase for Christians in Pakistan is street sweepers. There was recently a Muslim cleric who was speaking about the blasphemy laws in Pakistan, which have victimized quite a few Christians. And because the Christians are confronted and they say, do you believe Muhammad is a prophet? And they say no, and they say you blaspheme. And they're under arrest and they're killed by a mob, or executed judicially. In any case, he said, these sweepers are asking for the repeal of the blasphemy laws. And this is the utmost insolence. Sweepers, because they're street sweepers. That's the kind of jobs they have. They don't that are taller than the local mosque. Well, they would all have to be destroyed or converted to mosques themselves, because the non-Muslims' houses of worship cannot be higher than the Muslims, and non-Muslims are not allowed to build new houses of worship or repair old ones. So if you have any churches that are going through any kind of renovations, that would have to stop. Also, we talked, Eric was talking about taxes. There is a special tax in Islamic law, the jizya, which is specified in the Quran, that non-Muslims pay as a sign of their submission to the Muslims and their acceptance of this inferior status. And the Muslims don't pay it. Now, not only it's not just a little extra tax that you have to pay. The Caliph Umar, who was the second successor of Muhammad as the leader of the Muslims, according to Islamic tradition, none of that really happened. Anyway, Umar is supposed to have said, be sure to collect the jizya, the tax, because it's the source of livelihood for yourself and your descendants. It's the source of your livelihood. Have you ever been to Pakistan or Saudi Arabia or Egypt or any Muslim country? Anybody?
Egypt.
Egypt. Did you notice a whole lot of people hanging around on the street?
No.
No? Oh, well, okay, there you go. But actually, you will find, maybe Egypt is, well, I think if you go back to Egypt in a few years, you'll see more. But maybe Egypt is a bit more secular. But there's not a whole lot of a work ethic in Muslim countries. There's some fabulously rich Muslim countries because they struck oil. But otherwise, what industries besides oil are Muslim countries known for? Persian rugs? What else? Paprika. I don't know what that's. Anyway, the point is this. There are a whole lot of people hanging around on the street doing nothing. Generally, these are, of course, very large places. Because there's not a whole lot of a work ethic. Because the whole structure of the culture and society is based on the non-Muslims paying the tax and financing the Muslims in their endeavors. If you look at the great Islamic empires of the Middle Ages, when they were these huge economic and military powerhouses, the Ottoman Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate, the Fatimid Caliphate, and so on, they had these huge Jewish and Christian communities that had reasonably recently been conquered and were paying the tax into the treasury. When those communities became impoverished, because all you have to do, I'm outlining, all these different aspects of Islamic law, all you have to do to get out from under all this humiliation and discrimination is convert. And so, when Egypt was conquered in the 7th century, it was 99% Christian. Now it's 10% Christian. The other 89% didn't leave Egypt, they converted to Islam. Because over the centuries, it's tough to live this way, under this grind of poverty and degradation all the time. And so most of them converted. But the thing is, that once those communities became impoverished, and could no longer pay such large sums into the treasury, then the empires went into decline. And this is why Islamic law stipulates that the caliph, there is no caliph now, that's one of the things that the Muslim Brotherhood and the other groups in Egypt and Tunisia, North Africa in general, want to reestablish is the caliphate, the extra supranational unity of the Muslims. The caliph has the responsibility to declare jihad against a non-Muslim state once every 10 years at least. Right now, there's nobody who can do that. The whole point of that is because the non-Muslim state always has to be waged war against, and the Muslim state always has to expand so that they can bring in new people who are paying the tax and keep their economy going. Yes.
But isn't that the ultimate fallacy, like socialism? If you manage to take over the entire world and subjugate the entire world, you have no money left.
Well, then Jesus will come back. You know, Jesus is going to come back in Islam, but he's going to break all the crosses and destroy Christianity and Islamize the world. But yeah, once the whole world is Islamized, then we'll be in the end times. So that's not a problem. But yeah, you're quite right. Yes. It's kind of the shark of human culture.
Croc TV.